My name is Corky, and I'm with Yolo Basin Foundation, and we're going to get started this evening. And to do that, I'm going to share this really pretty picture that Lewis Kemper took of the sign down by the check station. I think that's amazingly beautiful. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Joe Hobbs, the Wildlife Area Manager for the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. Find out what's going on out there, a little bit about some of the research and projects, and maybe some of the challenges that he runs into. And then just as a reminder, next month, I'm actually personally really excited. We're going to be hearing from a woman who is involved with a program called Motus. And Motus are towers that pick up these little tiny tags that are put on flying things. So birds, bats, and large insects. And she's going to be sharing with us about how the Motus towers are developing in the West, where we have one now on our wildlife area, and several of the other CDFW sites throughout the valley and the Delta and other parts of the state are getting these. So for me personally, I'm really hoping we'll get to know where our bats go when they leave us at the end of the summer. All right, so I'm going to now spotlight up Joe so that we can hear all about what's going on in the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. Welcome, Joe. Thanks.
Thank you, Corky. So I'll get into the presentation here in a second. My name is Joe Hobbs. Been the area manager here, I think just about 4 years, started in February 2018. Yeah, I'm actually going to bring up my presentation to make sure that's working properly. Sorry about that. So again, my name is Joe Hobbs. I've been at Yolo for just about 4 years. I've been with the department as a permanent employee for 22 years. I was also 5 years going through undergrad and graduate, working for the department as a graduate student assistant and a scientific aide. In between those times, I worked for Ducks Unlimited down in the grasslands out of Los Banos. I've had several different positions with the department over the years. I've ran the private lands management program up out of Redding in Region 1, worked in timber harvest review, worked in the wetland program for the department. And then prior to coming here at Yolo, I spent 13 years as a statewide elk and antelope coordinator. But today we're going to talk about Yolo. I work in the Bay Delta region, Region 3 for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Yolo is just on the edge of the Bay Delta region. It's basically, almost in Region 2 or Sacramento County. Previously, before they redid the lines, Yolo was in Region 2. The screen shop, who's still on site in our shop area, is actually part of Region 2. So it's kind of unique that we're kind of split right down the middle almost. So Yolo is the largest managed wildlife area within the region as far as staffed. The other main wildlife area we have is Grizzly Island, just out of Fairfield. So in 2001, the wildlife area was expanded with the purchases of additional 12,000 acres of several different properties. So then you're looking at a total wildlife area acreage just under 17,000 acres. It's about 22 square miles, and all this occurred by 2005. So the wildlife area itself is open sunrise to sunset. We're unique in that we actually have a gate on the DWR levee that needs to be locked at sunset and opened at sunrise. So every day but Christmas, the gates are actually stayed closed on Christmas Day. There are 7.5 miles of auto tour throughout the wildlife area. No bikes, horses, or dogs on the auto tour. We do allow dogs and bikes on the northern portion of the Causeway unit, so between I-80 and the railroad tracks. And the wildlife area is open to hunting, both waterfowl, pheasant, and dove, and for fishing. And each year there's about 4,000 students and 8,000 hunters that go through the area each year. This is prior to COVID. Some of those numbers are going to be reduced because of the reduction in students. So in total, we just actually finalized, this shouldn't say draft, this is the final hiking map now. So there's a little over 18.5 miles of total trails throughout the year, but during the winter, many of those are closed. So it's about 2.8 miles during the winter of hiking trails. Again, like we're saying, we're open to hunting and fishing. Obviously the tuna was not caught, on the wildlife area. So the other main uses of the wildlife area are wildlife viewing and nature study, basically bird watchers. People come out, enjoy the wildlife, painting, different things like that. So the Yolo Basin is responsible for the education and outreach on the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. So they run the educational portion of it. They conduct a lot of the tours, the school kids, the bat tours, all basically run by the Yolo Basin Foundation. So here, the students, through the Yolo Basin Foundation and their docents and volunteers, learn about wetlands and wildlife. And then through the discovery of Flyway, since 1997, there's been over 71,000 students run through the system from K through 12 schools. So one of the most popular aspects we have is the bat walks and talks. Those are run typically from July through September, roughly 50 tours a year, with over 3,000 people attending those tours. Again, with COVID, it's been a little bit reduced, hoping we can get past COVID and get back up to that. But it's probably one of the funnest things, feedback for, that people enjoy on the wildlife area, at least for the summer months for sure. So here's a picture of the bats. This is looking up into the cracks underneath the freeway where the bats roost. Yolo is unique in that it is a wildlife friendly, it does have wildlife friendly agriculture on it. So we have grazing and farming. So the current value for those leases is each year is over $700,000, brings into the wildlife area. There are 3 leases, 2 grazing leases. The main one basically in the southern half of the wildlife area. And then we have, I think it's between 400 to 600 acres on the Causeway unit, and there's a little piece north of the railroad tracks that is also in grazing. And then the rice farm, which is about 2,000 acres. The leases are overseen by the Yolo Resource Conservation District. We have a contract that we pay the Yolo RCD to help us implement and oversee all the aspects of those agricultural leases, which is quite extensive. It's much more work than I originally thought it would be, and it's not easy. So I appreciate their taking that task on. So the funds that we get to operate the wildlife area, again, a portion of those are from the grazing leases. That money, along with state match, is matched by federal dollars. That's part of the Pittman-Robertson grant, which is an excise tax on sporting arms and ammunition, and that's run through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So for every $1 that the state puts in, basically we get $3 from the feds to operate the area. So like I mentioned before, rice, you're looking at about 2,000 acres, rice on the area. And part of the agricultural lease for the rice is some habitat work. So each year they are obligated to flood up 2 different fields or areas for shorebirds. It's about 150 acres for 30 days, one in July. There's a window on each end, but typically 30 days in July, 30 days in August. One of those areas has to be accessible basically by the auto tour or wildlife viewing for people. The other one, could be anywhere within the rice fields, depending on what they have going on. They will rotate rice fields between wild and white rice at times, or if we have a project going in, we know that area is going to be impacted and we don't have the good water delivery because of a ditch revamp, they may utilize that of rice to be able to put for shorebirds and not impact their production values. The rice is used by all different kinds of wildlife throughout the growing season. Here's a duckling when rice is just starting to sprout, probably less than a foot high there. And then it grows throughout the summer and then is harvested, starting in September through November. This is a picture of white rice. It's not nearly as tall as the wild rice. It's harvested dry, so those fields are drained prior to harvesting, dried out so they can get equipment in there and harvest the rice. Wild rice, seen here, is much taller. It's a shorter crop, so it's more suited to growing in the actual bypass with some cooler temperatures. Because we are subject to flooding too, they may not be able to get in time to plant and get a full 120-day crop in of white rice. Again, different varieties have different growing season lengths, but white rice, wild rice, they typically can get in and plant. So unlike white rice, wild rice is harvested wet. So basically they have special harvesters. These are tracked. You see the front wheels there. or tracks so they can operate within the wet environment. And immediately, after the harvester goes through, you're going to see wildlife respawn. Here's ibis and egrets, feasting on post-harvested rice and the critters that are left behind within that as well. So what typically happens after the rice is harvested and dried out, depending on if it's white or wild, is the farmer will go back in and post-manipulate those fields, such as mowing it or disking that stubble in, basically trying to prep it for next season when they're going to plant it again. This year, we had those unprecedented rains in late October. There was no way for them to go in. It was just going to be too wet for too long to do that. So wild rice was harvested earlier. So those are already flooded up behind the harvesters. But the white rice, most of it was not, if any of it was post-harvest manipulated. So work with the farmer, go ahead and let's flood it up. So you'll see a lot of the rice, it doesn't actually look like it's flooded. It's because the stubble is much taller than it normally would be on a normal year. So there's actually water underneath there. It's just not overtopping most of it. And we try to keep things different depths, flood them across time, so they're not all flooded at exactly the same time. We can't do it anyway. They just don't have the infrastructure to flood up 2,000 acres, within a couple of weeks. So you see different depths. Some of it's dry for longer. Geese love getting in there and getting all the waste grain. And there's hundreds and hundreds of pounds of waste grain per acre on post-harvested rice fields. The results, you see, wildlife respawn. It's basically at this point acting as a wetland, seasonal wetland. You'll get swans, cranes, geese, shorebirds, waders, you name it. They get into the rice fields along with the seasonal wetlands that we have. So on to the grazing, roughly 5,000 acres of grazing land. It's both irrigated and dry land. The one thing that's unique with the irrigated pasture, typically in the valley, there's not a lot of water across the landscape in the summer. The irrigated pasture actually provides that. Water or moist environment creates insects. Insects are utilized by a lot of the wildlife, including young ground nesting birds. So it's a pretty good boon for the local wildlife using the wildlife area during. So one thing, I don't think this, I forgot about the sound, Corky, but anyway, one thing that we saw last year was pretty incredible was the amount of geese that use pastures starting in February, actually January through April. This is one of our irrigated pastures here. The snow geese got in there and we're just really enjoying that new sprouts. Unfortunately, it pretty much never rained again after that. So the growth on those pastures before irrigating was pretty slow or pretty slim. But we see that use by geese, of those pastures, and it's pretty incredible. But grazer's not overly thrilled with it. That's kind of dollars going out of his pocket, but it's just part of the deal when you're grazing on a wildlife area. So the other benefit of having grazing is it reduces the competition for the native species for the non-native annuals, specifically in the vernal pools. You'll see all the annual grasses, the cattle will get in there and set those back, allowing the native to flourish. So the wildlife area, again, it's a unique situation. It's first and foremost, it's flood control. It's taking floodwaters around Sacramento to reduce the flooding, of the capital. It also is agriculture, it's wildlife, habitat, and public use, all intermixed, in an area right outside of Sacramento and right outside of Davis. So that's pretty unique as far as wildlife area goes across the state. The wetland management equals water management. How we manage our wetlands is basically when we put water on, when we take water off, how long it's on, how deep it is while it's on, and how fast it goes off. So the seeds that we're growing and the plants that we're growing for food in the corresponding next fall are actually grown when that water is drawn down in March and April. So it depends on the soil temperature, draw the ponds down. We can draw them down fast, we can draw them down slow, or a combination of both, and basically target certain species such as swamp timothy or watergrass, which are heavily used by waterfowl in the following fall. So they produce a lot of seeds, and you'll see swamp timothy grows probably less than 12 inches on the ground. A lot of people think the ponds look bare. It's pretty much swamp timothy across those that are producing seed heads to be eaten. So, our water movement, again, through ditches, water control structures, pipes, pump stations, you'll see all our pump stations are elevated. They're elevated for a reason because it is capable of being flooded, 10, 15 feet deep. So those electrical pumps need to be above those floodwaters. And then the beaver, love them or hate them, they're they are probably the hardest working, animal or wildlife that I've ever seen. If my employees worked as hard as them, this would be outstanding. But they want water to go where they want it to go and not where we want it to go. And it's such a controlled and manipulated environment that we're at odds fairly often with the beavers and trying to get them not to move water where they want it to go. So, vegetation management, just food and cover. I kind of mentioned that, we're growing the food in the late spring, early spring, early part of summer, and then that food is consumed in the following fall. So, example, like the upper right-hand photo here, you see where the swales are. Those are basically just depressions across a wetland unit, basically from where the water comes in to the exit. It allows us to manage water quickly. You can actually draw down water quicker off the benches and into those swales to try to get water off quickly. And the same thing when you're trying to flood up. You can flood up those swales and then put the boards in on a water control structure and then flood it much more quickly you could if the swales weren't there. Again, pump stations, discharge pipes, screw gates, all different kinds of water control structures throughout the wildlife area. There's probably between 500 to 700 water control structures at least across the wildlife area. So one of the unique things too is we have listed species, snowy plovers, Swainson's hawk, giant garter snakes, tadpole shrimp, berry shrimp, all make unique management, across the area, not only for waterfowl, but for these listed species in the work that we can or cannot do when they are present. And flooding like this, when you have a flood year that's just wall to wall, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to do anything for those species. They're pretty much out of there at that point in time. So road maintenance, I think I mentioned this if you've seen the talks before, is an ongoing, never-ending situation. It's all year long. You get high visitor use with the traffic from the wildlife tours, from the hunters, farm equipment, cattle guys, all that are just pounding our roads. And this year, the roads are particularly bad. We do not have a grader, which is what we use to maintain the road. Our grader, I think maybe 2 people in the wildlife area are older than the actual graders from 1978. It finally pretty much had its last day of use sometime early summer. They were supposed to get a new grader this month, so hopefully we can get that. Now I just need an actual employee operator that can drive the actual grader itself, because I'm down a permanent position. So, but road maintenance happens all the time. And one of the things that for road damage or levee damage, it's not so much when the water is 15 feet deep, it's when it's just a couple inches going over roads or going over levees. That has scouring. It'll take those areas and you get washouts, or just high water, with wind waves lapping against a levee like this. You'll see that erodes it quicker than if it was 15 feet deep and just moving slowly over the top. Again, lots of vehicle traffic, heavy equipment, all that, just beating up the roads throughout the whole entire year. Again, wall-to-wall water makes it very difficult. So our main habitat type is seasonal wetlands. These are shallow water habitats. These benefit waterfowl, shorebirds, wading birds, such as ibis and egrets. One thing also that you get with shallow water habitat is mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can be a very big problem on wetlands, especially when they're close to major metropolitan areas. We work closely with our mosquito abatement district here, the Yolo Vector Control. They will come out when we know we're going to flood fields, either pre-treat those with larvicide or with appropriate, or if it's something we're going to hold water for a longer period of time, they put mosquito fish in there as well. They will dip those, basically checking for the counts of larvae to see if they need to be treated or not. We also work with them for best practices, management practices, to try to reduce the breeding grounds for those mosquitoes, taller grasses, things like that. We try to keep that to a minimum. So again, our mosquito abatement district is really good to work with, very proactive. So one question I get a lot of times, where does the water come from? Most of our water, probably over 95% of it, is surface water. So the tides in the tow drain, which is the north-south ditch on the eastern portion of the wildlife area, tides push those back over Lisbon Weir, which is about 3/4 of the way down on the wildlife area on that tow drain. And so that water is held back by that weir and slowly released from that weir. And while it's being held back, you take pumps such as these low lift pumps, pump them out of those ditches and put them in the gravity fed water controlled ditches to basically flood the wetlands or irrigate the wetlands on those ditches, and it's gravity fed from there. So we do have a couple deep wells. They're not designed to flood up any substantial acreage. So probably, less than 1,000 acres, I think, could be flooded from our deep wells. Most of it are used to do irrigators or supplement some water on some of the units that we can't get gravity water to. So the pumping cost, it's all electric. It's gone up since I got here. So we're looking at over $300,000 a year for my PG&E bill to flood the wildlife area. So I don't worry about leaving the heater on a little bit longer or higher in the morning when I get into the office, because it's not what's causing me to spend all the money. So now I'm going to kind of talk about some habitat projects, go briefly over stuff we did in the past, last couple of years, and some of the projects coming up. And I think the most important part of this will be probably the question and answer, like trying to address things specifically. So in the past couple of years, Ducks Unlimited has done a lot of work. So you saw last year that the 2 new bridges that were installed to increase water flow throughout the wildlife area. At the Y, the pump realignment, so that pump was moved from the west side to the east side. We cleaned out a big section of ditch to help water delivery and drainage. And then in the Parker unit, there was a new pump installed there to flood new wetlands, basically wetland creation. So last summer, we were able to clean out a big section of ditch, I think just maybe 3/4 of a mile in our 1,000 acres unit. And this year, we should be able to do the Greens Lake clean out and cross canal pump. And I'll show you a map where those are and talk a little bit more about those in detail. So here's the stuff from 2020. You'll see in the upper section, the red and black cross hatches, that's the I-80 ditch clean out. We cleaned out that section of ditch. The yellow square is where at the Y, we'll remove the pump station and put a new bridge in. The red square at the right corner, again, new bridge there. And down lower on the left, a little bit of purple, that's the Parker pump unit went in there. And the blue is the wetland unit that's going to be flooded from that pump. And that was all Proposition 1 Delta Conservancy funding for those projects. So here's an example, the bridge at the Y that was put in not this summer, but summer before. Examples of the Parker unit, again, completely new pump station, new electrical settling basin, and it's all gravity fed out of there into the new wetland units. You can see the square at the bottom is where the Parker unit is, where the new pump and wetlands will be created. We had some setbacks on that. Pump needed to be repaired right after we put it in, so we did not get stuff flooded up this last year with that. We're going to flood it up. Hopefully by the end of this month, those units will be completely flooded up. So in 2022, this coming up project, you'll see the orange line and the orange and black hash. That's the Greens Lake cleanout. So they're going to deepen Greens Lake, which is a natural lake, increase the capacity. The spoils will be used to raise the road on the east side of that. That's typically a low section of road that goes underwater when water comes up fairly easily, and it stops, back to our road route, our access to different portions of the wildlife area. So hopefully this project, can address that, make that road more passable for a longer period of time of the season. And then another one is a new pump station and ditch clean out that'll help. This pump station actually kind of reverse. It's going to take water off the fields when there's still high water, in the corresponding ditches and tow drain. So we can basically draw those fields down sooner than we normally would be, hitting it, making it easier to grow rice and easier to manage the wetlands with the project. So one of the things that we see in the last couple of years is the Pollinator Upland Habitat Project. So we took out 70 acres of rice fields that used to be rice and putting it into basically pollinator habitat. So CWA initially did the habitat work a couple of years ago. So basically sculpted it, put the swales in, we made some islands, made some deeper water habitat, and then they planted it with grasses. And those grasses did really, really well. So they were planted in the fall. That winter, we actually got good rains. They were looking good. And then after that, I think River Partners planted rhizomes like milkweed and things like that. But when they planted those in that following spring, it never really rained again after that. So those were not the great success at that point in time. We think they're still there and still viable. But what we also saw, I'll go through this. So here's just after the grasses were planted. You can see the basically little furrows where the grasses were planted. Again, we had some areas where after the initial Plantings of the water control structures were not put in, so the water impounded on some of the areas. So there's some areas that didn't do as good as others. Here's the initial dirt work by the CWA crew or contractor. And here's the grasses coming in, really well, the first fall, spring. And so what happened when we didn't get any rain and those rhizomes were planted, we worked with river partners to see maybe we can get an irrigation on those and try to save those rhizomes, get them going. So we were able to get an irrigation on them. I think it was late May sometime. We got the water on, and then at the same time, the rice fields started flooding up. Ditches were full of water. We could not get the water off quickly. So basically, a lot of the areas were impounded, and water stayed on longer than we had wanted. It grew a lot of vegetation, a lot of watergrass and other stuff, not the target species that we're hoping for the pollinators. So the other project we have is with California Waterfowl Association down in the Martins unit. This Martin unit is the bottom of the wildlife area section in red. What the plan here was to create some brood ponds, some upland areas, and a new delivery ditch. This is actually supposed to go in last summer, but with the inflation and prices of the project materials really going through the roof, we couldn't have done the project as planned at the same level. So we postponed it, hopefully to do it this summer, to see if the prices on those materials came down. I'm not sure if they are going to come down. We may have to reevaluate exactly what extent we can finish this project. It may have to be scaled back slightly, depending on the cost of materials. But here's an example. You'll see some new upland units, some islands, some swales, and a brood pond. And here's where the new ditch is and some new water control structures. Again, moving water on and off wildlife areas or the wetland units is the key to management. So Poudre Creek salmon, if you listen to Mackenzie's talk last week, she covered a lot of the details, but basically where that is at the check station, the check dam, I should say, in the middle of the wildlife area is a barrier for salmon migration up through Poudre Creek. So that dam is in place because it backs water up that the department and outside ag users use. So we will back that water up at the check dam and then low lift that to flood up our wetlands. Same thing, the outside ag users and our irrigated pastures take water off that same system. So we try to flood up our wetlands as quickly as possible. We still have limitations by how much we can flood early with mosquito abatement. And so it depends on water availability, all the other things going on. But we try to get that flooded up so we can pull that check dam as early as possible. But we're working on basically a bypass to have salmon go around that check dam so it can remain in place and not impact the salmon trying to come up there. We're working with several partners, Solano County Water Authority, Poudre Creek Council, Yolo Basin Foundation, and Poudre Creek Trout to try to come up with an idea that we can get the salmon around the dam, not impact the ag users or the wildlife area's ability to flood wetlands. So this is a picture from the actual check dam looking to the west. So this portion back, what you're looking at will be, when the boards are in, will be up to the bank there, and our pump station is around the corner from this picture. And we'll take that low lift pump and take that water to put it on the wetlands. So here's a conceptual design of the actual bypass channel. It'll go to the basically west and north of the check dam. That's parking there for reference, and then through a series of step downs, go around and then go back into where the Poudre Creek channel goes back into the tow drain. So the Solano County Water Authority is working on water deliveries to offset that water flow that goes through there. So there's basically no net loss of water available to use by the users, and then salmon can bypass that. And as soon as everybody's flooded up or done using the system, those boards can be pulled, and then the salmon can go up the main channel. Mackenzie kind of talked about it last week. It was one of the major things that happened this fall in the wildlife area. Is what we saw is just a tremendous drop in the dissolved oxygen level. And throughout, we had fish die off all over the bypass on the wildlife area, and even south and north of the actual wildlife area. Things, like catfish, carp, bass, let alone the salmon and other fish, were found dead everywhere. And it was instantaneous after that storm. We started finding these dead fish, working with the Solano County Water Authority, our own department's investigations. Instantly, you saw a drop in dissolved oxygen. So here's a graph from the Lisbon Weir, which measures dissolved oxygen in real time. So that storm event, in late October, you can see that huge drop off. It was about, it was in the 8s, and then it just tanked and it went even further, basically to 0, and for an extended period of time. So it started to come up, and it would just go right back down. So we saw that, for well over a month of just really low dissolved oxygen levels. So basically, it hadn't rained at this time probably, in 10, 11 months, 10 to 8 months, something like that. And, who knows what was washed into the system or what was going on. There's a lot of different kinds of theories, but the result was low oxygen level. If you're killing catfish and carp, salmon don't stand a chance. But here's a graph, different scale, but looking from 2 years, from January 2017 to January 2019. And you'll see, at times, those oxygen levels do drop, maybe into the 5s, 4s, and that's in the summer, when it's hot, it's 110, not a lot going on. There's occasionally they'll drop below that, but it's usually in September, maybe when rice fields are being drained, things like that. But and they look back years, and that was this drop that we had recently was not seen, previously for a long period of time. Again, and here's a larger scale looking at early December this year to just the other or today. You'll see that finally, mid-December, the oxygen levels increased greatly, and then started, their daily or seasonal fluctuations depending on rain and stuff like that. They've dropped a little bit this last couple of weeks, but it's still really good. It's no longer a problem. So one of the theories was, primrose clogs all our waterways, clogs the delta. Anywhere that you have water in the summer here, you're going to have primrose. That huge storm in a year basically of no rain washed a bunch of debris and other stuff into the water systems and started decaying instantly, which reduced the amount of dissolved oxygen available in the water. These are 2 pictures of primrose at the check stand that were cleaned out when they removed the boards still at the water through. I mean, this was completely plugged up, and this scene repeated itself all over the bypass and all over the wildlife area. One of the other projects, and it's wrapping up this year, is the Yolo County or Yolo Resource Conservation District Prop 1 Wildlife Corridors Escapement. So basically, on the trussels on our southern end, they went to establish native vegetation to be used by wildlife when floodwaters come up, on those mounds that run east-west, so they can see the next mound. And when they are trapped on those, they do have cover and food, and won't be susceptible to just be dying as quickly. Hopefully the floodwaters recede and they can get out of there in healthy condition. So that's what we see there. It's looking at one of the trellises, and there's a series of trellises. It's old train tracks. Again, they told me it's the electric railroad in the past. So there's sections that are longer and sections that are shorter. They're cut. One of the interesting things in the next month's speaker, we'll talk about it, is the Motus wildlife tracking. This is actually not a Motus tower. This is a tower that was pre-existing in the Causeway unit of the wildlife area that people from headquarters within the department supposed to be put a wildlife tracking antenna on one of these towers, and now they can track animals, small animals that can't have big transmitters on them. And there's a series across the state, actually a series of them across the United States, try to pick up these critters that they're putting these trackers on. Working with elk and antelope. With elk, I could put a car battery on it. It didn't matter size; it wasn't going to hinder it. So I had no problem, with getting GPS, satellite, 9-year battery life, that type of stuff. Little critters like bats, dunlins, things like that. Shorebirds. They even, Corky was telling me they were able to put one on dragonfly. So those aren't going to have much power, and they're not going to have much battery longevity. So these series of towers can pick those up when they get near them. They can be, I think, up to maybe 10 miles, depending on the transmitter itself. But recently, around Thanksgiving, they picked up a dunlin, and then Levi from downtown also mentioned that they picked up another shorebird. I can't remember which one it was, sometime after Thanksgiving. So one of the things too, what we saw, like not this season, the season before, was the first time in quite a while that the Causeway unit was grazed. What we saw too was just a tremendous response by geese this time of year in February and March last year. This doesn't even show the extent of what Goose used those fields. Now that they were grazed off, it made all that new growth that's coming in just really available to the geese, and they heavily used it. If you drove over the Causeway, you probably saw the response that we got from geese at that time. So this year, even with the drought, we were generally able to get flooded up as normal. We had a couple setbacks with one of our piping systems from that new pump station at the Y. Those are actually one of the rare ones that are actually underground pipes, not just ditches. They have alfalfa valves, basically like a screw cap at the end, and one of those leaked. And so we were trying to flood up some of the units, but it was leaking into the rice field. And they still haven't harvested that rice field yet. So it delayed it a little bit. But in general, even with the drought, we were able to flood up pretty close to normal. A lot of the water rights across the Delta were curtailed. The bypass wildlife area has several different types of water rights, so we were still able to use our riparian water rights as long as water was a system. So basically, by the time we started flooding up for wildlife, in September, October, most of the ag users are done. So there was enough water to allow us to flood up fully with no real noticeable difference from the previous years. That's kind of my end of my presentation. So at this point, if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than willing to answer them and see what
we have quite a few that have come in. So why don't we start right with when you were talking about rice? And the question was, how do they handle the rice straw after harvest? Till it in, flood it to decompose it, something else?
Yeah, it's a combination of everything. So typically they would go in and mow it, chop it up, and then disc it in, and then flood it, which helps decompose that harvest, or that basically bulk straw that's left over. This year, that's not going to be the case. So we have a postseason meeting with all our ag users. It's going to take more work for them because they were not able to do that and not incorporate it into the soil. So it's not going to decompose as well as it typically would. So he's anticipating a little bit more prep time coming this late winter, early spring. So he'll typically, we'll start drawing down those fields in maybe mid-February, depending on the fields, we'll stage it. So he can get those dried out as quickly as possible and get his equipment in there. It all depends on the year. Some years, if it does, like last year, he was able to get in there super early, didn't have any problems at all, it stayed dry. So he was able to manipulate those. Some years, if it's flooded or we get constant rains, he may not be able to get in there till after April, May. And saw 2 years ago that it was flooded for so long that they had 600 acres of rice that they couldn't plant. It was just too late in the year by the time it dried out to plant. And you'll see we actually saw a pretty good reduction in waterfowl use around those areas because there was nothing in those fields. There was basically bare dirt at that point in time.
What kind of insecticide is used for the mosquito population control?
So I think it's mainly larvicide. I don't know exactly, and then they use I think some pyrethrum as well for adulticide, but I don't know exactly off the top of my head.
Okay. Can Yolo look into solar-based pumps?
So we actually are to a degree. So we're trying to look at solar array fields. So basically to offset the cost of the pumping, but when we pump, we're pumping 24/7, high use, and the solar may not be able to keep up with that directly just on the field for there. The other thing is they need to make sure that the infrastructure for the solar fields is not susceptible to flooding. So even if you have a solar array field and it's in the floodplain, all that other infrastructure and electrical connections need to be high and dry. So actually working with some nonprofits to see if we can find a spot. Like we do have a piece of property that's outside of the bypass, it's just on the other side of the levee, that we could potentially put a solar array field. But you're looking at usually 5+ acres that we needed to offset those costs. Now, they are going to put a solar array field around basically the headquarters and the shop area, and that itself, because it's all tied in the same grid, will be able to offset a lot of the electrical costs for the department. So those type of savings, the more we can do is going to be beneficial long-term to save costs.
I think you addressed this, but was there a reduction in the water supply during the 2021 drought? So
not specifically for us, because we did have riparian water rights. As long as there was water in the system, we were able to utilize it, but we didn't irrigate any of our wetland units or anything like that during the summer. We did have to use our deep well along Puda Creek instead of the low lift pump because there just wasn't enough water in that system for the outside users and the irrigated pastures to be able to pump low lift. So we did use our deep well at that point in time.
Is there a way to check where there is water and if it's a good day for wildlife viewing?
So we, yes and no. We have a water board in the office, that our main employee goes and updates it on a basically weekly basis of where there's water. I think that's probably a good question, is that maybe we can do something a little bit more proactive and get that up on our webpage. So for people to know what areas are flooded, and when they're flooded up by. So that's something actually we can work on. It's not that hard. Just need to get the map, work with downtown so they can post it. I don't have access to those pages to post it myself. It needs to go through somebody else. But yeah, that's a good idea.
Or maybe even Yolo Basin could help with that.
Yep.
Because
yeah, I mean, the quick route is we take a picture of it, like we take it out to the check station. Here's the flood up map. Yolo Basin can post it on their book. I like to have something a little bit nicer than a picture of a 1982 map, with blue chalk on it. So.
What were the escape railroad tiles for? The person says that she didn't hear or understand who uses them for escape.
So the wildlife, as the floodwaters come up, what you'll see is wildlife go to those elevated platforms, those trestles, and get trapped. And so you'll go by there. There's photos in the past, when it was flooded wall to wall, that there'll be deer on there, raccoons, skunks, coyotes, rabbits, all that stuff. Basically with nothing to eat and no vegetation. So if they can see vegetation on the next trestle, which isn't that far away, especially if the water isn't super deep and flowing, they can get to those. And if they can't, at least they'll have some escape cover within there. Also, they're very vulnerable to predation at that point in time. Hawks, everything, can prey, on the stranded wildlife. So it's for food and cover, and so they can actually have a visual escape route too. Because the further west you go during that time period, the shallower the water is, but they can finally, get off the flood.
Are there particular conditions that bring in the swans?
I don't know. They seem to just kind of show up at the same time, each year. And maybe be a certain water depth that they're looking for. I know like with pelicans, it's a little bit different. We had the floodwaters, and after they receded, it trapped a lot of fish. And so those basically pools were just huge feeding grounds, for large, numbers of pelicans and egrets would just get in there. It's just like a buffet with all the trapped fish and stuff. So, but for swans, I'm not sure. Couldn't tell you besides time of year.
Do you think they like the wild rice better than the conventional?
I think there's more spillage. This is just off the top of my head, as far as waste grain, with the wild rice. And it's early, so they get in there. And what you'll see is those fields are just hit pretty quickly by geese. And it's basically, they'll feed it to a point and go to the next field. There's still a lot of waste grain left, but it's just like picking up, spilt Cheerios. Like, here's a huge pile, go to here. There's another huge pile over here. I'm not going to just continue to pick up singles, but I can just, scoop it up with my hands in the next field. Rice waste grain has a certain number of days while it's inundated before it basically starts to decompose. And I can't remember I want to say 30 days, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It's like watergrass or some of the other wetland plants. The seed is more, it's longer life while it's basically in the water.
Did the water curtailment in 2021 affect water use for neighboring lands? And if so, how much of their water use affected water supply at the Yolo bypass?
So I don't know exactly. I know that there was a lot of water not put on like other wildlife areas, depending on where they are in the system. Their water was curtailed greatly. Lower Klamath, Tule Lake, huge reductions in their water supply. It just wasn't available. Same thing with like Gray Lodge and some of the Upper Valley, wildlife areas. They didn't get their water supply, from behind the reservoirs in their water districts. So it affected them greatly, and I'm sure it affected, rice farmers as well. To the extent, I'm not sure. It didn't so much affect us because we're at the bottom end of the system, and our water is mostly tidally pushed back out of the delta, up to us for the most part. So,
you think that affected the number of birds that we're seeing this year?
I'm not sure. What I did notice over the summer, even though we had, as valley-wide, huge reduction in water on the landscape, we actually had our brood ponds, because we weren't working on them, in other areas that had water, probably more than since I've been here, just because everything was set to go. But yet, and this wasn't for Yolo alone, we saw less broods. I almost saw no duck broods across the summer, even though I had brood ponds that had water in it. We saw adults and other stuff use those ponds, but very few broods. And when we met with other wildlife area managers, they were seeing very similar stuff. Almost no broods. So not sure what happened, because it's not just on the scale of Yolo, it was a much wider scale. So either they were using areas that we didn't see them in, which I'm not sure, really happening for us, or they just decided if they were going to breed, they were going to go somewhere else.
Do you have any partnerships with the university where people come in and do wildlife research?
So yeah, we work like McKinsey's at UC Davis. So they will basically ask us to help them basically with access. Not so much that we're funding any of their research or anything like that, but it's mostly an access issue. So we've worked with UC Davis, Sacramento State, even some of the JC colleges for students over the years to have access, So what we haven't done, which is probably a good idea, is some of the questions that we want answers, try to cooperate with or work with universities that have a student that can help answer a question that we have directly. Like one of my things I want to look into is basically small mammals, pre and post grazing, to see if there's any difference, or grazed and ungrazed areas with those numbers. Because also what we see too is, and this is all incidental, is after a post flood, there's no mice, there's no voles. Those are all basically being killed out by floodwaters, 10 feet deep for 30, 40 days. And then what I saw, like after my first or second year here, there was just tons of raptors in the spring. The second year, after a flood year, very, very few raptors. There were no Swainson's-hawk, groups of 20 and 30. And it made sense because we flooded. There was nothing for them to eat on the small mammal scale at that point in time. So it's those type of stuff that will be interesting to work with some students to be able to collect that data for a question that I have directly.
Do you have any trail cams out in the wildlife area?
So we don't directly, but that's a good question. I meant to put it in there. We did have trail cameras out as part of the department-wide bobcat study, and they're still waiting on some of their data. But they had a series of cameras on grids across the wildlife area during the summer before we flooded up. Pictures, things that I would expect: coyotes, raccoons, no bobcats. But they have not composed all their data to tell me the final result.
Not seeing more questions come in from our, here we go. Just about the time I said that. What efforts are made to coexist with the beavers, or are they trapped?
So we don't trap them. So basically we try our best to get the water control level at a point where they stop plugging the water control structures. But there are times when they are actually depredated in critical infrastructure, or what they do is they burrow under roads as well, collapsing, the main thoroughfares that go through there. So for the most part, we try to avoid that at all costs. It is a wildlife area and it is for all wildlife, but there's certain things where we just need to get the water moving. We'll every morning go in, clean the water, where they've plugged up water control structures, remove that vegetation. They create dams across waterways. I've gone through, or had the guys gone through with the backhoe, remove just a huge dam. Next day, that dam is bigger than it was the day before. It's pretty incredible for a critter with no thumbs that can work, as a family unit all night and create something that I'm not sure we could do as good a job with heavy equipment if we were trying to stop water. So it's interesting. We do our best to coexist with them. For the most part, I think it works out. Occasionally, we do have to depredate.
And where are they? Where are the beavers?
Anywhere that you look on the wildlife area that there's water, there's going to be a beaver close by. So,
do you know of any active lodges?
Yeah, they're all over the place. And it's not the lodge that you would see the traditional picture, like in a mountain stream, there's a big pile of sticks. It's burrowed underneath a roadway or into a levee bank that they use. We have actually the main road that runs north south through the wildlife area, just out of parking lot J. They completely burrowed through that a couple weeks ago. Matt went out there, said the road had some holes in it. He's looking at it. He said he could actually crawl through. He didn't do it. That burrow system that they made from one end of the road to the other, it's like 15, 20 feet long. And so we had to collapse that, bring in fill dirt, and then find some gravel to put on top of it. Otherwise, the whole southern portion of the wildlife area was going to be closed because it was unsafe. So yeah, somebody on a Sunday, it's like, okay, there's a hole with some water moving under it. That happens, all the time. That went out on Monday. It's like, it's not just a little inset on the edge. It goes all the way across. So they burrow through, the systems, roadways, levees, all types of stuff like that. So.
Have you seen any nutria on the basin?
We have not. What's interesting is as soon as you told people there could be nutria there, then you get reports of nutria. So whenever we got a report, and this has been a couple of years, we would put a trail camera out, and they're usually near an active beaver, areas we know there were beavers. And so all the pictures we got were either of beavers, otters, things like that. So no nutria at this point.
Will a copy of your slides be available to the docents? And I'm assuming you mean slides directly. We are recording tonight's talk, and that will be up on our YouTube channel probably early next week.
So I can send this stuff to you, Corky, if somebody wants direct copies of it. They can either contact me, my email, or you, and we'll get to them.
All right. And yes, direct copies. So great. Yeah, we can work that out. All right. Well, it looks like we have all of our questions here. I do want to put in a plug again for next month for Mary Whitfield and her talk about the Motus wildlife tracking system. Joe mentioned it. We have our first tower up in the wildlife area, and they're going in around the west, which is really exciting and kind of fun to search around on the motus.org website, because you can see what kinds of things are happening in other parts of the world. It's not just in the United States, although admittedly the eastern part of the United States does seem to have the highest percentage.
It's pretty incredible. I was telling Corky earlier, when I was doing my master thesis, I had a telemetry truck, which is basically an old vehicle at that time with a huge antenna at the top. I was tracking geese throughout the valley, trying to get the locations of those by triangulation. So 2 known spots, put the points on the map and calculate that out. Versus, my last couple of years and like now in the elk program is GPS callers logging in, see real-time movements, where they are, the amount of data that's collected now from GPS compared to, on the ground tracking, exponentially better, easier, and highly more accurate. I typed in a number wrong. I had goose locations, from the Central Valley that were showing up in the Pacific Ocean. It's like, I'm pretty sure that's not where they were. And I just, put it in a wrong number into the system. So now it's just great. We can see what happened is I would lose a goose for 2 weeks. I just didn't come across it in the valley. Someone would read a caller in Lower Klamath in January. Basically, it warmed up, winter, geese flew back north, stayed there for a few days to a week, froze up, came back down. You would never notice that because they were back, within a couple of weeks, even for the callers. But they're doing these huge movements all over the place, on a regular basis. Not every single critter, but enough of them that every time I ever put callers on enough animals, you saw stuff that you didn't think was going on because you just continue to see the same group in the same area, but they may, just like ducks in the day, may go feed in the Sassoon, fly back here, go to willows, go down to the grasslands. It's nothing for them to do those huge travels, and you just think they just stayed, within a couple miles. So these type of towers for those critters that we can't put, heavier batteries and transmitters on, it's going to be pretty interesting to see those movements when they show up, where they're going. Are they staying? Are the bats moving around to different areas of the state and coming back? So it's going to be very interesting.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for joining us this evening, sharing your knowledge about the wildlife area, answering all of our questions. Appreciate it immensely. And
no problem.
Like Martha's waving at you.
Hey, Martha.
And many people put it, thank you, into chat.
So thank you all for coming. Again, thank the Yolo Basin Foundation. Truly, all the work they do in the outreach, the department does not have the staff or resources to do. So that partnership is greatly appreciated. Again, we just could not do that level of work with school kids and other people that the foundation does. So I greatly appreciate that partnership.
We love working with you. So it's great. And get out and visit the wildlife area, get out and explore, see what you can find, and share it with us because we want to know.
the roads have a few potholes in them, so you may want to go. So they're basically road bumps by de facto at this point in time. So speeding is not a problem at this point.
But the birds are great. The roads are marginal, but the birds are great. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks all for joining us this evening. Good night now.